Great. Well, this whole week is called Think Again, and we're encouraging people to think again about different things, and particularly each night we're looking at this question of think again about Jesus. And if you think about it, even if you weren't at all interested in religion, even if you were just thinking about it from a kind of historical or a sociological point of view, the figure of Jesus is fascinating, isn't it? Think about it. You know, he split history in two, and today a third of the world's population claim in some way to follow him. And yet it's surprising that very few people ever take time to really think about him or to think again about him. So just from that kind of point of view, it's interesting. But then when you think about it in terms of Christianity, if you really want to understand Christianity at all, you really need to understand Jesus, don't you? Someone once put it this way. They said if you take Christ out of Christian, you're only left with three letters, I-A-N, and Ian can't help you. Now, that's a cheesy joke, so I shouldn't use it. But basically, that's the point, isn't it? Christianity is about Jesus Christ. If you take Jesus out of Christianity, there isn't much less. And yet, when you talk about Jesus today, there are so many different ideas people have about Jesus. So you get people talking about gentle Jesus, meek and mild. This isn't going to work, so maybe you can advance it for me. Gentle Jesus, no, it's gone back. No, forward. Yeah. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. And you know what gentle Jesus looks like? He's often wearing white. He's got the kind of blue sash around him. And he's either holding a child or he's holding a lamb. So that's gentle Jesus. And then you've got religious Jesus. And he's much more austere. He's got a gold plate behind his head. And you see him in stained glass windows and painted on church ceilings. And then you've got moral Jesus. Moral Jesus will teach you how to live. He'll tell you what you should do, and he'll tell you what you shouldn't do. That's moral Jesus. And then you have liberal Jesus, and he doesn't really care how you live at all. Liberal Jesus just says, doesn't matter what you do, how you live, it's all fine by me. Let it all hang out. That's liberal Jesus. And then you've got political Jesus. Political Jesus will surprisingly agree with whatever your political opinions are. And whether they're right or left or somewhere in between, political Jesus will reaffirm your political beliefs. And then you have revolutionary Jesus, who can start revolutions. You've got the idea of a prophet Jesus, the idea of Jesus who was a prophet, but only just a prophet, not anything more than a prophet. And then there's the idea of married Jesus, who was married, if you read the Da Vinci Code, to Mary, and had children, and the bloodline of Jesus that goes down to today. You have good teacher Jesus, who'll tell you different good teachings, although we often don't read his teachings. There's Simpsons Jesus, and he's Simpsons, and he's yellow. And then there's cool Jesus, who has an iPod, because that's cool apparently. There's plastic Jesus, who really genuinely is plastic, Jesus action figure, and it says that he has a gliding action. So that's very exciting. That's plastic Jesus. And then you have Super Jesus. Super Jesus is particularly cool because whatever you want in life, Super Jesus just gives it to you. Okay, so a big house or a big car or a big wife. Well, maybe not a big wife, but whatever you want, you just name it and claim it, and if it doesn't work, blame it. So that's Jesus, he'll do it for you. And we have all these different ideas about Jesus, and you can end up thinking, well, who was the real Jesus? The problem with all these ideas is that they can end up telling us more about the person who has the idea than actually about who Jesus was. How do we get back to the real Jesus? In northern Spain, a few years ago, there was a painting on the wall of a church. If we just have that up, firstly. This was Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, a picture of Jesus as he's about to be crucified. And as you can see, it's kind of peeling away, and it's being kind of damaged. And so one of the nuns in the church decided to take it upon herself to mend the picture and touch up the painting. And this is what she did. She absolutely trashed it. This became a bit of an internet sensation. News of this spread around the world. People called it the Monkey Jesus. In fact, Ryanair started flights to the nearby airports because there were so many people that actually wanted to go and visit it. And they charged them all £1 each, and they paid for all the work that the church needed doing. But Monkey Jesus is still there. But actually, the thing is, for 2,000 years, that's what people have done with Jesus, isn't it? They monkey around with Jesus, making their own ideas, And you can end up being so far from the real Jesus, you can think, well, who was Jesus at all? Well, actually, all week we're going to be suggesting that the best way to discover the real Jesus, the Jesus of history, is to actually look at one of the books that were written at the time. And that's why these books are out on your tables. This one is written by a guy called John. He was an eyewitness of the events in Jesus' life. And as you might think, if you want to look at a figure from history, the best way to get back to it is to look at the primary source documents, of which this is one of them, when it comes to Jesus. And so you can take that away, you can read that, that's free. And as we look at those accounts of Jesus, we see different things. And what I want to do, just kind of briefly tonight, is take a kind of like a helicopter tour around the life of Jesus and see some different aspects to him. So firstly, let's consider his popularity. Consider his popularity. When you look at Jesus, the fascinating thing about him is that so many different people were attracted to him. So you've got Jewish people, of course Jesus was a Jew, but you've also got Gentiles who hated the Jews and they liked Jesus as well. You've got men, but you've also got women. You've got religious people and you've got irreligious people. You've got a tax collector, a guy called Matthew, who's part of his close group of followers, along with another guy who's a religious zealot. Now, these two guys would have hated each other because a tax collector was someone who had sided with the Romans and basically kind of sold your soul to the Romans. And a religious zealot was someone who hated the Romans so much that they literally kept a razor blade in their sandals to kind of, on a dark night, do over any passing Roman soldier he saw. But these two guys are in the same small group of Jesus followers. There's this kind of unique and universal attraction to Jesus. And still today, why is it that this Jesus figure can draw people from so many nationalities and walks of life and cultures and personality types? There's something about his popularity. Secondly, I'm thinking again about his teaching. It's funny, isn't it? We use expressions like go the extra mile or turn the other cheek. And some people have never considered actually where those expressions come from. They come from the lips of Jesus, his own teaching. His own teaching 2,000 years later still forms part of our language today. And there was something remarkable about Jesus' teaching. People commented that when Jesus taught, it had a unique authority. You could say in some ways that Jesus' teaching was teaching without footnotes. He didn't rely upon the authority of other people to make his points like we would do when we write an essay. Footnotes can end up taking more than the actual essay, can't they? But Jesus, he just spoke on his own authority. He just said, I tell you the truth. And his teaching was surprising. It would be understandable if he taught love your friends, but he said love your enemies. Not just do good to those who do good to you, but do good to those who persecute you. His teaching was challenging. He taught that actually it wasn't just enough to avoid murdering people, but he said you shouldn't hate them. It's not just enough to avoid committing adultery, but don't have lust in the human hearts. G.K. Chesterton, one writer, put it this way. He said, when we consider the teaching of Jesus, we don't find that people have tried it and found it wanting, but we find that they found it difficult and they've not tried it. Because actually when you look at it, you think, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if people lived this way? But can anyone live that way? So think about his teaching. And thirdly, think about his character. We get so used to the fact that so many of our heroes today kind of have moral lapses. You kind of have childhood heroes and then they get shown up for what they're really like. I remember growing up watching TV. My two favourite programmes, Jim Will Fix It on TV and Rolf Harris's Cartoon Time. And yet, well, we know what's happened to the reputations of those two individuals. And so often you have famous people and then the other side of the story comes out. But with Jesus, you could say there was never any mud that could stick when it was thrown at Jesus. Even though people were tried, even though they wanted to accuse him of stuff, they couldn't. There was something about his character that was just different. He didn't just teach love your enemies, but he really did love his enemies, including the ones that ended up crucifying him on a cross. And radically for his culture, he taught women and included women in his followers and raised the status of women through the way that he taught. There was no kind of derogatory attitude towards Jesus from Jesus. towards women, towards outsiders, towards anyone. And then when Jesus is on trial, Jesus has the audacity to be able to say to everyone there, he says, "Who of you could accuse me of doing anything wrong?" Now, if I was risking it, I might say that here because I don't know many of you, but I certainly wouldn't do it amongst people who have been around me for a few years because they would all be very quick to speak up. But Jesus said it and no one could. Something exemplary about his character. Compare that, for instance, to Muhammad, who said that 70 times a day he prayed for the forgiveness of God. Yet although Jesus taught others to pray for the forgiveness of God, he never ever prayed for it himself. His character is fascinating. Then his lifestyle is fascinating as well. I find what's really interesting is that the main accusation that people had towards Jesus, get this, is that he wasn't religious enough. Which, considering that he is now considered the founder of the world's biggest religion, is a strange accusation to make, isn't it? But people were saying, well, you just don't do what a religious leader should do. I mean, and he didn't. He went to parties, he went to weddings, he enjoyed himself. He turned water into wine. I think some people think he should have turned wine into water, but he did it the other way round. And he was once accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. Now, he wasn't, but to be accused of being such means that you have to drink and eat quite a lot, don't you? It's not normally what you would accuse a religious leader of. And yet the irony today is so many people say to me, I'm not interested in Jesus because I'm not interested in religion. And I think, well, actually maybe you would be interested in Jesus then, because he doesn't strike me as the average religious person. His lifestyle was different. His fulfillment of prophecy. Check this out. What's so fascinating today is that, when you read biographies, it used to be that when you read a biography, someone had to either be dead or nearly dead before the biography was written. But today, biographies get written earlier and earlier. So if you're a footballer, you write your biography at 25. If you're a pop star, 18. It's younger and younger. But check this out. Jesus' biography was written before he was born. So actually, the Old Testament part of the Bible, the bit of the Bible written before Jesus, in so many ways and on so many occasions talks about how Jesus would come, where he would be born, the circumstances around his life, and in particular his death. The chances of one person fulfilling even a few of those things is absolutely minuscule, and yet perfectly Jesus again and again fulfilled all of these prophecies. Now some people say, well, maybe Jesus he just kind of did it deliberately. So he was aware of the prophecies and he tried to kind of fulfill them, which on some occasions would be possible, but it's a bit harder to arrange the details of your birth. That's kind of difficult, isn't it? And unless you take your own life, it's very hard to arrange the details of your death. And yet many of the prophecies are about those. Other people say, well, maybe these prophecies were written retrospectively, kind of afterwards, after the events. But actually, that can't be the case either, because we know that the Old Testament was written before Jesus, partly because we have so many copies of Old Testament books that predate Jesus today. His fulfillment of prophecy is fascinating. And then consider his claims. I come from Bournemouth, and I remember running a cafe in Bournemouth, and we had a number of students from different nations coming in. And I was chatting to a French student a couple of years ago, and we're talking about Jesus. And I said to him, what do you think of Jesus? And he said, well, I think Jesus was just a good teacher. And I said, have you ever considered any of Jesus' teaching? And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, have you ever read part of the Bible, looked at his teaching there? And he said, well, no, I haven't. And so I said, would you mind if I read a bit of it to you now? And so we had not this, but a book quite like this with the same text inside, John's Gospel on the table. And so I picked it up and we turned, and I just read one verse from chapter 14 where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God except through me. So I read this out, and he looked at it and he heard me say it. And as I did, his mouth dropped open, literally. He looked at me in shock and he said to me, Jesus was not a good teacher. And I said, what do you mean? He said he was incredibly arrogant to say something like that. And I said, well, absolutely. You see, it's very easy to say Jesus is a good teacher until you start to look at his teaching, and then you realize that lots of his teaching is incredibly egotistical in that it centers about himself. Again and again, he talks about the fact that he was something. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. In fact, when he talks about himself being the I am, he was taking the name of God from the Old Testament and applying it to himself. And on other occasions too, he talked about how God the Father and himself were one. He claimed that he was around before Abraham was around, and Abraham had lived and died 2,000 years before. He claimed to be able to forgive people's sin, although people knew that only God could do that. He claimed that his words would last forever. He claimed that he was going to be the judge of the earth, even though he had told other people that it wasn't their job to judge, it was only God's job. And he accepted people's worship. Imagine if I was standing here at the front, and then Sam gets down on his knees before me and says, "Michael, my Lord and my God." Now, if he was to do that, I might be quite flattered, but I might have to say, Sam, I think you probably overstated the case somewhat. That's probably going a bit beyond what's true. But someone actually did that to Jesus. And Jesus rebuked them, but not for saying it, but for being so slow to say it. Which makes you think, doesn't it? Who is this person that is making these kind of claims? His claims are fascinating. But not just his claims, seventhly, his abilities were fascinating too. You see, here's the thing. I could make ridiculous claims, couldn't I? I could go out into Bristol tomorrow lunchtime with a big billboard on saying, "I am the way, the truth and the life." And you would all think I was crazy, okay? And you would be right. Anyone can make claims, but it's another thing to actually make people believe what you're claiming. And yet Jesus somehow did. How? Because he seemed to back up these outrageous claims with some incredible actions. One particular instance stands out, where Jesus is in a house, he's teaching, it's absolutely packed, no one can get in through the door, and yet these people come to Jesus with a paralyzed man, obviously expecting that Jesus might be able to heal him. Because they can't get in through the door, they go up on the flat roof of the kind of Mediterranean-style house that they would have been in, and they dig through the mud roof and create a hole in the roof and then lower this guy on his stretcher down into this crowded room, which has now become even more crowded because they're all having to stand back and tread on each other's toes to allow room for this bed. And Jesus looks at this paralyzed man and he says to him, "Your sins are forgiven." Now, as we said, that was an outrageous claim to make because he was claiming to do something that only God could do. And everybody obviously understands this, and some of them are muttering to themselves and saying, "Who is this guy making these kind of claims?" And of course, anyone can do that. I mean, I could say to Sam, "Your sins are forgiven." You wouldn't know whether that had happened because he's not going to suddenly turn green or start hovering above the ground. You can't verify objectively whether that's happened. And Jesus knew that. So what he said next is interesting. He said, "And to show you that I've got authority to forgive sins." And then he looked at the man and he said, "Get up and walk." And this guy got up and he walked out in full view of them all. See, Jesus wasn't just making great claims, but he did great things. He was able to heal the sick, to make the paralyzed walk. He could calm the storm and walk on water. He could feed the thousands with a little boy's packed lunch. A unique authority. Now, I know considering those kind of miracles today creates all sorts of questions for a lot of people. How can you believe in miracles? Aren't miracles impossible? And so on. And tomorrow lunchtime, we're going to look at some of those arguments. So come back tomorrow lunchtime. But I would just say this at this point. If there is a possibility that God exists, then we cannot exclude the possibility that miracles could happen. And don't exclude the possibility that miracles can happen before you actually look at the evidence for it. But if they happened, these abilities are incredible. But then consider also his death. If you read a biography, I love reading biographies, you normally find there's loads about the person's life, and there may be a paragraph, at most a page or two, about the person's death. And yet, when you come to the accounts of Jesus' life, up to a half or a third of those 4 accounts are taken up with the events surrounding Jesus' death. You see, it's as if the people writing down about Jesus were trying to get our attention to the fact that it was his death, perhaps even more important than his life, that was really significant. That actually Jesus wasn't coming to lose his life in some kind of accident or to take his life in some selfish way, but actually he was coming to give his life. But we'll think more about that tomorrow. And then his resurrection is fascinating too. You see, there are many great people through history and many great religious leaders, but there is one who stands out as unique in terms of his claim, that actually he isn't just a figure from history, but he's a figure who's alive today. Jesus claimed that he didn't just have the answer to death, he claimed he was the answer to death. Which I have to say is incredibly important in a world where 1 out of 1 people die. I woke up this morning to my phone buzzing in the early hours with a news flash saying Jonah Lomu had died aged 40. I remember aged 14 watching Jonah Lomu totally transform rugby history as he trampled over Tony Underwood and Will Carling and Mike Catt and everyone else on his way to the England try line 4 times. He was an incredible rugby player. And yet, 40 years old, and he's gone. And the reality is we live in a world where people die. And Jesus says, I have got an answer to death. Which kind of makes me think it'd be worth thinking about, isn't it? And he says, I've not just got the answer, I am the answer, and I am the answer because I am the one who's going to conquer it. And we'll think more about that claim on Friday. But when you look at all these things, you have to kind of come to the conclusion, well, who is this? In fact, if you read through the account of Jesus' life, his followers who have been following him for this 3 years of his public ministry repeatedly ask that question. They're looking at all these things, they're hearing all these things, and they're saying to themselves, who is this? Who is this guy? And the conclusion that they eventually come to is this, that in Jesus, none other than God himself has stepped into human history. Now, when you hear that claim that in Jesus, God has stepped into human history, there are lots of yes buts that immediately come to in our mind, don't they? You might say, well, but did Jesus really claim to be God? I was doing a discussion recently, and a guy said to me, he said, Jesus never actually said, I am God, did he? So why should you believe that? Well, there are some good reasons why Jesus didn't say, I am God. If you went around in that culture claiming that you were God, people might kill you. In fact, when they finally realized what he was claiming, they did. So there was good reason not to just immediately say it at the beginning of your public work. And also, there's a big difference between telling someone something and showing someone something, isn't there? It's much better to be shown the conclusion rather than just told the conclusion. And just because Jesus didn't say it, it doesn't mean he didn't make it abundantly clear. I'll give you an illustration. I live in Bournemouth, and my friends have a lovely little beach hut down, obviously, on the beach. And opposite the beach hut in the summer, there's a big hut that says RNLI on it, Royal National Lifeboat Institution. And it's sitting there through the summer, and there's some people that sit outside. Now imagine I go swimming out to the sea, and there's about 50 yards offshore a row of boys, okay? Not male children, but boys, okay? And if you try and swim to them, the lifeguards get really upset, because if you go beyond it, you can get hit by boats, and it's a bit dangerous. So imagine I go swimming out, and I'm thinking, I'm going to see if I can get there. I get all the way out, and I get nearly there, and then a speedboat comes up, and it's yellow and red, and someone in a red t-shirt comes up to me, and they say, oi, you can't go beyond that, and they haul me into the boat, and they take me back to the shore. Now imagine if I came back home, and I said to my friends, today I was swimming, and a guy from the RNLI came and rescued me. And he says to me, how do you know he was from the RNLI? And I say to him, well, he came from a hut that said RNLI on it, and he came in a lifeboat that said RNLI on it, and he wore a red t-shirt, and he rescued me from the water, and he took me back. And then my friend says, but did he say, I am from the RNLI? And then I think to myself, and I think, no, actually he didn't use those words. And then my friend says, well, clearly he wasn't then, was he? Well, that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? All the evidence points in the direction. Just because he doesn't say those exact words doesn't mean that it didn't actually happen. Jesus never says, I am God. But when you look at the evidence, it all points in a certain direction. Some people think, well, isn't this idea about Jesus being God just a later invention? Did people invent it years later maybe in the 4th century for some political reasons. But actually all the evidence points to the fact that it was the early Christians, the earliest Christians, that came to this conclusion. In fact, there's a fascinating bit of archaeological evidence on this. If you just look at the next picture. And they found this in Rome. And it dates from probably the early 2nd century. And it's a cartoon. On the right, it's just a clearer depiction of what the cartoon is. It's a cartoon of a man with a donkey's head that's being crucified, and another man who's worshipping this crucified figure. And then some text scrawled underneath that says, Alexamenos worships his God. And so it's clearly designed to deride and mock Christians by someone who obviously wasn't a Christian. But what's fascinating about it is that it shows that even from a few years of the life of Jesus, even the enemies of Christians and Christianity knew that Christians worshipped a man who had been crucified, who they believed and worshipped to be God. Even the enemies of Christianity knew that from the outset. In fact, there's a fascinating extra little bit to this. If you were to look to the side of that, there was someone else who had scribbled next to the cartoon, Alexamenos is faithful. So maybe that was a Christian who was trying to get their own back. We don't know. But it's not a later invention. And lastly, some people might say, well, wasn't it easier for them to believe than for us? I was chatting to someone at lunchtime, and they said to me, I just couldn't believe that Jesus was God. And for lots of different reasons. If you're an atheist, of course, it would be hard to believe. If you're a Muslim, it's hard to believe. For lots of reasons, it could be hard to believe. But can I say this? For the first followers of Jesus, it was equally hard to believe. Why? Because most of them were Jews. And the one thing a 1st century Jew knew was that there was one God. And that God was in heaven. And that you couldn't have idols. 400 years in exile had kicked that out of them. They knew that there was one God. They weren't likely to easily start ascribing deity to a carpenter from Nazareth. And so you have to think, what was it that convinced these people to go against the grain of all of their expectations to believe what they eventually did believe about Jesus? Was it that the evidence was so compelling that there was no other option? Well, if that's true, what are the implications? Well, very quickly, we'll look at it more later in the week. Firstly, if it's true, it means God exists. And the greatest evidence for the existence of God is not evidence for the beginning of the universe, or evidence for fine-tuning of the universe, or evidence for morality, although those things are fascinating. The greatest evidence is a God who has stepped into human history. Does God exist? This would answer the question. What is God like? This would also answer the question, wouldn't it? Because Jesus is saying, if you get to know me, you get to know what God is like. Which I think is wonderful, because Jesus is so much better than the expectations that we have about God. He blows out of the water so many of our preconceptions about who God is and what is God like. You see that God is so much better than we would ever imagine. So as you look at Jesus, you see whether God exists, you see what he's like. And thirdly, you can see that you can get to know God. You see, because Christianity is about a person, not a philosophy or an ideology, but about a person, then as you get to know that person, you can get to know the God who exists. And that's what Christianity ultimately is about. It's not about learning a new philosophy or obeying a new set of rules, but encountering a person. Not just a person who lived historically, he did that, but a person who is also alive today, who we can get to know. It's a relationship with a God who really exists. That's what is at the heart of the Christian faith. Now, we're going to have some questions in a minute. Before that, we're going to have some tea. Before that, I guess I just want to ask this question, for you to think about. And that is, I wonder what you think about this. I wonder what your thoughts are. You can tell us by texting in a second. But maybe you're thinking, well, actually, to be honest, I wouldn't say it because it'd be a bit embarrassing, but I think this is all rubbish, okay? Maybe that's what you're thinking. And maybe you think, well, I don't believe any of this. Well, if that is you, firstly, thanks for coming, and thanks for listening. But if that's you, we'd really encourage you to actually think about this for yourself. And one of the best ways to think about it, as I said, is to take this little account of the life of Jesus and to read that through. it'd probably take you 2 or 3 hours. But if you're going to have intellectual credibility over this, it'd be worth looking at one of the source documents before you write it off, okay? Don't write it off before you've investigated. Take that away and have a read and see what you think. Maybe you're thinking, I don't think this is rubbish, but I have no idea really how this all works and how it fits together. Well, there's something coming up. Actually, it was on the screen a minute ago. And Tiff's going to stand up quickly and tell us what's going to be coming up. What's happening next week, Tiff?
Okay. Starting from next week, so if you have been listening and you think that you'd like to look at this evidence for yourself, we have a Christianity Explored course. Please put it on your table. We'll be running for 4 weeks. We'll be looking at the Bible, like we'll be opening the Book of Mark together with you. We'll go through it as a group. It's a chilled environment, held in a pub. Should be really great. Good to see you there. And come talk to me after if you'd like to.
Great. So Christianity Explored, if you want to find out more, great things to do. But the third thing to say is, actually, you don't even have to wait to Christianity Explored to get to know this God who exists. If Jesus is the way to God, then actually you can start to get to know him now. You see, there's 2 ways you can get to know about someone. The first way is you can check them out on Wikipedia, right, if they're famous. But you can read about them. But there's a second way you can get to know someone, and that is actually you can meet them. You can encounter them. And as a Christian, I want to say we can encounter Jesus personally. And actually, one of the ways to do that would be to start talking to him. You might think, well, I've still got lots of doubts and questions. That's okay. You could simply say something like this. Jesus, I'm not even sure yet whether this is all true, but if it is, and if you are who I've heard about tonight, I want to start to get to know you. Help me to get to know you. And he will. Because he wants to get to know you more than even you would want to get to know him. But he's a gentleman. He doesn't barge his way into our lives. He waits to be invited. So by all means, investigate from the outside, but even better, get to know him personally from the inside. Well, we're going to take a break for a couple of minutes, and there's flasks over here. So get tea, get coffee, keep eating I know you've all eaten the bourbons. It's down to you've eaten the custard creams as well. It's right down to the dregs, isn't it, on the biscuits. Maybe we'll drag out some more bourbons if you're really good. Keep eating, grab a coffee, grab a tea, text me your questions. The other thing is, on your tables, there are some little feedback cards like this, and we'd just love to know your thoughts about the evening, and you can do that anonymously if you want. So just pass those around now, and grab a pen, and then just write down what you thought of the evening, what you'd like for dinner tomorrow. We can't guarantee that will fulfill on the expectations of everyone. But if you'd like to find out more about Christianity Explored, or just generally you'd like to investigate further, then filling that out and leaving your details, ticking one of the boxes, would be a great way to make sure that we don't miss you and we can get in contact, okay? So just fill that out now, text your questions, grab a coffee. We'll be back for kind of 10 minutes of questions, okay?
Wasn't it unfair that the only one generation got to encounter Jesus?
Okay, yeah. Basically, wouldn't it have been amazing to live 2,000 years ago? You could have met Jesus, you could have physically seen him, you could have audibly heard him. We don't. So isn't it unfair? In one sense, yes, people did have more of an opportunity to physically encounter Jesus then than we do today. We don't have that option. But that doesn't mean that we cannot encounter Jesus today. I think that's the important thing to remember. Although our experience is different to the experience of the first eyewitnesses of Jesus, we don't physically see him, we can still have really good reasons for knowing that he exists. We can have lots of good reasons for getting to know what he's like. We've got 4 accounts of his life, we've got the New Testament and so on. And also, as a Christian, I would say, as I get to know Jesus, Jesus himself said by his Spirit, he can actually come to live alongside and within, so that I can encounter him, not physically kind of seeing him face to face, but I know the presence of Jesus in my life now. Actually, that's a better thing in some ways. In fact, Jesus said to his followers on one occasion, he said, it's better if I go away than if I stay. And you're thinking, well, that's a bit weird because it'd be better if he stayed. But you think about it, if Jesus is physically present in Bristol, he can't also be present in Bath. and in Southampton and Bournemouth and so on. But Jesus says, there's going to come a time when I won't be physically present with you, but he said, actually, by my Spirit, I'll be present with all who trust me, wherever they are, whoever they are. So it doesn't mean we cannot encounter Jesus, we can. And it doesn't mean that our faith is without reason. Jesus said to, you might, if you've ever read the Bible, remember an encounter where Jesus meets Thomas, doubting Thomas, and Thomas doesn't believe until he sees Jesus. And then Jesus says, blessed are you because you have seen me and believed. More blessed are those who haven't seen me and yet have believed. Which some people pick up on and say, well, there you go. Jesus commending blind faith. But Jesus isn't commending irrational faith. He's not saying, blessed are those who see without thinking. He's just saying, blessed are those who believe without seeing. We can still have good reasons for faith. We can still encounter Jesus by his Spirit. And one day the hope is we will see him too. So in one sense, it's not a problem. And in some ways, you could even say it was better. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. So this kind of ties in with the next question. You've kind of already answered bits of this, but what does it mean to know a person that died 2,000 years ago?
Yeah. Well, if that was the end of the story, then I guess our knowledge of Jesus would be pretty much the same as our knowledge of any other figure from history, which is we can get to know about their life, we can know what they did, but we couldn't personally know them, which is why the claim of the resurrection is so important in the Christian faith. So big, we're going to do Friday night looking just at that particular claim because it's very much the foundation of the Christian claim. That is, if Jesus is alive, then we get to know him in a living and a real and a vital way as someone who was alive, not simply as someone who lived historically. He did live historically, and we can look at the evidence, and that's often where we start. We don't just start with our experience, because experience is not a good foundation on which to build our whole faith. It starts on the evidence, but then it goes from that to a personal experience as well. So, yeah, if he's alive, we can get to know him. And maybe one of the ways to find out about that, and I think over the next couple of nights we'll hear some stories, but is also to chat to other Christians and say, what is it actually like knowing God? What difference does it make having this real relationship with Jesus? Because it does.
Awesome. Great. What literature is there, in addition to the Bible, that Jesus existed and said and did these things?
Great. So what literature outside the Bible do we have? I will answer that question in a second, but I'll also, I don't know who asked the question or the kind of thinking behind it. Sometimes, I'm not accusing this question of coming with this intention, but sometimes people can ask me that question, and the assumption behind the question can be, well, clearly we can't use the Bible as a way of discovering Jesus because that's religious, it's biased, and it's not historical. So we're only going to take things about Jesus that we can find in other sources as well. And I would say that's a mistake. It's a mistake because actually you've dismissed the Bible without really examining it. Now, you shouldn't just believe the Bible because it's a religious book. We shouldn't give it special preference for no apparent reason. We shouldn't specially reject it either for the same kind of reason that it's a religious book. We can say whether or not it's God's word, whether or not it's a religious book, it's also a historical text. And as we'll look at tomorrow lunchtime, there are some really good historical reasons for thinking that the Bible is historically accurate. And so we shouldn't dismiss that and say, well, I'm not going to have it. But having said all that, there is reference to Jesus outside of the New Testament. There are, for instance, to start with, lots of writings about Jesus from other of the followers of Jesus from the rest of the end of the first century, beginning of the second century. So other Christians writing about their encounter with Jesus. There's less so, understandably, from people who are not Christians, because just as Christians had reasons for wanting to talk about Jesus, if you were not a follower of Jesus, then you may have good reasons for not wanting to talk about him. No one was neutral when it came to Jesus. But we have references in Tacitus, a Roman historian, Josephus, a Jewish historian, a guy called Pliny, Suetonius, who make reference to Jesus. But their primary purpose was not to talk about Jesus, but to talk about Roman history. And they reference Jesus as it had impact upon other things that they were talking about. From that, we can still extrapolate quite a number of things about Jesus and Jesus' claims. But if you really want to get to know Jesus, then the Gospels are going to be a way to really meet that out in terms of understanding more. So if you want to look into that claim more, just let me recommend one book. This book, Jesus for Skeptics, by a friend of mine called Michael Green. He's a friend of mine, but he's also 86 years old, so he's one of my old friends, quite literally. But the first chapter of that, or the second chapter of that, looks at the extra-biblical sources for Jesus that I just mentioned, examines them and examines what we can learn about Jesus if we were to take the Bible completely out of the picture. Yeah.
I think we've got a few more questions. Just grab them.
Great.
Is it possible to believe in the miracles of Jesus without assuming the Bible is complete truth?
Yeah, absolutely. So can you believe in the miracles of Jesus without assuming that the Bible is complete truth? I guess there's different levels you could take the Bible on. You could take the Bible on, as many Christians do, saying this is the Word of God, God's Word to us. And that's the historic kind of Christian conviction about the Bible. But you don't need to start with that. You don't even need to start with the assumption that the Bible is completely 100% true. You just need to start with the question of, could the Bible be a historical source that can tell me things about Jesus? Now, the problem sometimes we have is that people dismiss the miracles from the Bible. There was a president, Thomas Jefferson, who had the Jefferson Bible. What he basically did is he chopped out all the miraculous bits from the Bible, quite literally with a pair of scissors, and just left in the bits that he thought he was happy with. But his reason for doing that was not so much that those bits didn't have historical evidence for them, but his presupposition, which was miracles are impossible. And it's the presupposition rather than the evidence that's often the issue. And of course, if you have a presupposition that says miracles are impossible, then you have got to discount the claims of the miraculous. But you have to ask the question, is that presupposition right in the first place? Really stems back to a guy called Hume, David Hume, Scottish philosopher, who put this idea about the impossibility of miracles together. But the problem with it is, to know that miracles are impossible, you need to know that every report of a miracle in history is false. And the only way you can know that every report of a miracle in history is false is if you already know that miracles are impossible. It's kind of a circular argument. So I can totally understand someone saying, look, I've never seen a miracle, and I don't see any evidence of miracles around me. So I'm not thinking that miracles happen. But that's my initial assumption. But if I found evidence to the contrary, the wise thing to do would be to change your initial assumptions. That's what scientists do all the time, isn't it? You say, here's my initial theory. Gosh, the evidence doesn't quite fit that. I don't throw out the evidence because it doesn't fit my theory. I say, well, maybe I need to change my theory because it is contradicted by the evidence. And I'd say the same thing with the idea of miracles. Tomorrow lunchtime again, we'll look at how do we know that the Bible is, or particularly the gospel accounts of Jesus, how do we know that they're historically reliable? And how do we know that they weren't just made up stories? Yeah.
Awesome. If Jesus was God and all capable, then why would he choose to die?
If Jesus was God and all capable, why would he choose to die? That is a great question. Because I think in that question, you really get to the heart of the Christian claim. In fact, that very question was asked to me last October. I was in Malta, speaking at an event, much nicer than speaking in Bristol because it's sunny and warm. But I was speaking at an event and I was chatting to a student from Syria. Sorry, not a student, he was a refugee from Syria. And we were talking, sharing about his story, and then we were talking about Jesus, and a wonderful evening chatting. And he asked this question, he said, look, if Jesus was all-powerful, why did he end up dying on a cross? I'm going to think about this much more tomorrow. But one of the things we did is we just looked at the accounts of Jesus' life, and particularly the accounts of Jesus' trial and his crucifixion. And what you see, which is fascinating, is that Jesus looks like someone who's in control, despite the fact he's being tried and executed. Here is a guy who seems in control of the situation, despite the fact, to appearances, it would seem completely the opposite. Earlier on, in fact, it's in the books that you can take away, in the 10th chapter, Jesus said this. He said, I've got the authority to lay down my life, and I've also got the authority to take it up again. In other words, Jesus is saying, my death is not going to be like an accident, something that is taken from me that I can't help. But he says, actually, it's part of my plan. And so it seems, as you look at Jesus' teaching, that he knows that his death is going to happen. Well, we all know that our death will happen at some points, but he knows when it's going to happen, he knows how it's going to happen, and he sees that very much as part of his plan. But you'll have to come back tomorrow night, because that's what tomorrow night is all about. And so we're going to think more about it. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all the questions we have now.
Great, fantastic.
Um,
Just to say, just before the last notice, if you've got more questions, do chat about them around your tables, or come and talk to me. We're not going to kick you out, and we'd happily talk about this more. So please chat more now, and do have a look at the bookstall. I think you're about to mention it, aren't you, the bookstall?
Yeah.
But yes, I mentioned the books there. They're £1 if you're our guest. So do have a look at them later. Thank you.
Awesome.
Sorry, Charlie.